So it's been about 6 months now that I've owned the Nikon Z9, and overall I'm very pleased with it. It's a phenomenal camera, and the best part about it is that it's predictable. It performs in a predictable way, even if sometimes the ways in which it performs are less than ideal. It does that consistently, and therefore you can rely on it. You know how it's going to perform in every scenario. And for that reason, if I need to get a photo, if I am taking, say, a professional photograph, which I don't do very often, but I have photographed an event this year with this camera, it just performed brilliantly. And equally, when it comes to wildlife, it's a really, really good performer, and it has some fantastic benefits. But it is a very expensive camera, and if I didn't need a camera with a grip for what I do, I always like a gripped body for wildlife photography in particular, or if I'm using a camera for, say, events or things like that, then you just get the Nikon Z8. It's basically the same camera. But for me, this made sense, and yeah, I'm extremely pleased with it. But I do think there are some things to note, both good and bad, like there are with every camera, and this isn't going to be an in-depth review because there's tons of those on YouTube. But what it will be is a little bit of an overview of my personal experience with this camera so far, and areas where I think it excels and areas where I think it could be improved, and maybe things that I'd like to see in future firmware updates. So why don't we start with firmware updates? This camera has been supported so far by Nikon in an astonishing way. They've added so many new features to it. The autofocus is miles ahead of what it was when it was launched. They've added bird detection to it recently, which is something ported from the ZF. They have added 8K video support in a firmware update. They've added motion detecting, auto capture, and all this sort of stuff. But Nikon should really be commended for their attitude towards this camera and to their cameras in general. It's a really good reason to invest in the system because they have supported it so well so far. I see no reason why that shouldn't continue. And they're kind of putting a bunch of other camera manufacturers to shame somewhat in terms of the firmware updates. This is Nikon's flagship camera. They are treating it as such and offering it an awful lot of value added over time. Unlike, for example, Sony, who have kind of let the Alpha 1 languish somewhat for quite a long time now. So yeah, firmware updates, very, very good. No complaints whatsoever about that so far. So while I'm still wafting the camera around, let's talk ergonomics, because this camera's ergonomics are perfect, to be honest. For me, at least. I have quite large hands, not huge, but reasonable. It is a perfect camera in terms of size for me. Everything's where I need it to be. It's very, very comfortable. And I think Nikon have kind of nailed it. And that kind of shows by the fact that most of their cameras have extremely similar layouts, extremely similar control setups, positioning of all the things. The only difference between this and the Z8 is that this wheel with this weird locking thing is changed. I have no complaints. It is what it is. I don't love it or hate it. But in general, this camera is just exquisite to use all day, non-stop. I have no problems with it whatsoever. In terms of its design, the only thing that would make this a better camera for me is if they stole the design of the screen hinge from the Sony A7R5. This is a very, very good screen for photography. You know, being able to do things like this, it's a really, really handy screen to have for weird photographic things. It's perfect. However, if you do want to use this as a video camera, it's great if you're filming other people, and for that reason, it's a brilliant camera if you are working as a cameraman. But if you want to film yourself, the fact that the screen doesn't flip around is unfortunate because it's such a capable video camera. That is a downside to it. I actually thought that they would fix that on the Z8, but they kept the same mechanism. Obviously, this is limited to people like me who are actually trying to film their own face for whatever reason. So as a photography sort of thing, I actually think the screen design is perfect. But for video, it could be improved. And I think had they implemented that just additional axis of movement to the screen, it would make it effectively a perfect video camera, because it is a very, very good video camera. So yeah, that's the only real downside to the body design. Otherwise, it's brilliant. The vertical grip is great. You can still access most of the controls even when you're shooting vertically. I just love it. It's just a really, really nice camera to use. So I'll put that down before I drop it. So in terms of the actual performance of the camera itself, one of the more interesting parts, I think, is its colors, because it's both brilliant and bad, if that makes sense. The colors that come out of this camera by default, the ones that are in its standard picture profiles, or if you just use the standard settings when you import into Lightroom or whatever, are amazing for wildlife photography. Like, really amazing. They're great for people as well. They are just really, really nice colors. As you can see from some of these examples, they are just vibrant and great. This isn't on a vibrant setting or anything. This is just on the sort of standard color profile. The downside is, if you're trying to do more sort of landscape shots or things like that, I sometimes find the colors too vibrant, particularly the greens, which are very prominent here in Wales. And it's not an issue, obviously. You can dial it back and apply color profiles and stuff in post. But the greens are very, very strong when it comes to those sorts of photos. And for wildlife, that's fantastic. That's what I want. But if I'm trying to take landscape photos, I tend to modify the photos a lot more for landscapes taken on this camera than I do for any other type of photo. So just something to note, I don't think it's an issue in any way. Now, where I do have an issue with this camera is in its metering, which is kind of strange. The sensor on it is surprisingly excellent for such a fast sensor. It is able to lift a lot of detail out of the shadows. Take this photo I took at the National Museum of Wales. This photo was exposed for the highlights at the distant point in this tunnel, and so everything inside of that was completely black. And then after lifting the shadows, there's an awful lot of detail there. It's not perfect, but it's really, really good for what isn't a medium format camera. This is the sort of thing you'd expect to see a little bit better on a medium format camera. They have a better dynamic range. And this is how you should shoot the Z9 or the Z8. You should be shooting on highlight priority metering mode, because by default, with its matrix metering, it blows the highlights out constantly. I made a video on this earlier in the year where it felt like I was doing something wrong, but it's kind of impossible to avoid. If you're on a brightish day and the sun is shining off some leaves, those leaves will be blown out. On water, the highlights will be blown out. On birds, the highlights will be blown out. If it's a bright day, it is nearly impossible to avoid. So my solution to this is that I do shoot in highlight priority metering mode, and this solves the problem. You do have to bring your photos up again in post to bring the shadows, but it's got the detail in the shadows that it will lose from the highlights if you don't shoot in that manner. So that's my big tip for shooting this camera, is to shoot in highlight priority metering mode and just bring the rest of the photo up afterwards. You can denoise it with the AI denoising tools in Lightroom, all those sorts of things, and you will have no problems. Because the other side of it is, if you don't do that, you're going to blow out the highlights and they won't be there. It does not capture the detail in the highlights. And this is very different to other cameras that I've used in recent years. For example, the Micro Four Thirds camera, the OM1, was very good at maintaining detail in highlights. So you could shoot it always in the default matrix metering mode. It didn't matter if the highlights were too bright, because that detail was still there and you could bring it back. That's not the case with the Z9. And yeah, I basically shoot all wildlife on highlight priority metering mode. I would generally recommend using that in combination with changing the viewfinder settings to be for ease of viewing, I think it's called. And that kind of simulates what a DSLR viewfinder would look like. You're not looking at the photo as it will look as the photo. You're looking more like real life, Because if you don't do that and you have highlight weighted metering mode on and there's a very bright highlight in the screen, the entire rest of the photo will be like dark. It will be really dark in the viewfinder and you won't be able to see what's going on. So I think that's the better option there, is to sort of simulate like you're using a DSLR, highlight weighted metering mode, and the ease of viewing viewfinder settings. While we're on the subject of the viewfinder, the screens themselves, the viewfinder and the screen, are fantastic, great quality. But what doesn't work is the automatic brightness, which is bollocks. It just doesn't work. It's never bright enough in bright sunlight. And I gave up using the auto mode quite quickly. I set them manually. I have it on sort of, I think 5 by default on the viewfinder, which is crazy. And then I have it set to high 2, which is the brightest it could possibly be when it's a bright day. And you can see it on a bright day. It's fantastically bright then. But the auto mode seemingly never even gets to 5, let alone high 2. I think the brightest it's ever felt is about 2. So there's something wrong with it. I don't know why it doesn't seem to be mentioned elsewhere. Maybe I'm just crazy, or maybe I can't see very well. But I find it far, far too dim. This is the case on other cameras, though. I mean, the S5 II that I'm using at the moment, it has the same sort of issue. But it's less of a problem because I'm not using it for like action photography where I'm changing from bright to dark areas quite a lot in woodland and all those sorts of things. It's irritating that it's kind of a flaw on the Z9. Maybe the sensor that they're using isn't really good enough, or maybe their calculations are incorrect, but it certainly doesn't work very well. But it's easily solved just setting them manually for the day when you are where you're going to be photographing. So it's not really a problem, but it's something worth noting, I guess. And while we're on the subject of settings in the camera, I do find the custom mode settings in this camera quite irritating. You have 4 sort of custom modes by default, and I have them set to a button on the back of the camera. They're sort of shooting modes, and I have it like set to A, B, C, D. Great, and I have them set to a button, nice and convenient for swapping between them, and I configure them for different situations. So I have one set to general animal photography, I have one set to bird photography, I have one set to scanning for when I'm scanning film negatives with this camera. Great, but the problem is that it doesn't include the custom settings, the ones that allow you to actually change half of the settings of the camera. So this menu basically has its own separate settings bank, and it's not linked to the shooting mode. And I can't find any way of doing that. If you do know a way of doing this, please do put so down in the comments, because this is the one thing that's really wound me up with the camera's settings design. Otherwise, I have no real problems with it. But the main reason why it's so irritating is that inside the custom settings menu, under focus, is focus tracking with lock-on, which is the most useful setting when it comes to wildlife photography, because it changes how sticky your autofocus is. And because this isn't tied to the shooting mode, you're changing this for all of your modes at the same time, unless you also set up a totally different custom settings bank and swap that as well, which wouldn't be a problem, but you can't bind that to a function button. So you can bind shooting mode to a function button, and I have done so, but you can't bind custom settings bank to a function button. So even when you swap between one to the other, you then have to go into the menu and swap your custom settings bank. Why? That's just it. All camera manufacturers have flaws in their menu system, but that is complete insanity to me. And what I tend to do is just go and edit the setting manually. I have it on a custom settings menu. And yeah, I change it based on the situations, because if I'm photographing a bird in a bush, for example, I want it sticky. And if I'm photographing birds in flight, I want it not sticky. I want it to constantly pick up on the thing that's closest in the viewfinder. And that lack of ability to change that quickly is the only real annoyance I have with the settings in this camera when it comes to doing wildlife photography. It's the only thing that gets in my way. Aside from that, the camera is just easy to use in those sorts of situations, and that's perfect. But I do basically have to pick the sort of setting I'm going to be using ahead of time. So if I'm doing birds in flight, well, I have it set up for birds in flight. And if I want to do birds in bushes, which unfortunately birds tend to do both, I have to go and change that setting again. I would like to see this fixed in a firmware update. It's quite irritating, but it's not the end of the world. It doesn't really take that much time to go and change that setting. I just wish that it was tied to the shooting modes. If they moved that custom setting out into the shooting menu, into the photo menu, it would be fine. It would take care of that automatically. The alternative would be allowing a linking between those two different custom settings. It's just a really weird setup. It's much easier on cameras like the Panasonic, where you just set up a custom mode and pretty much all the settings apply to that custom mode. And then when you change to another custom mode, it's got a different set of settings. I mean, it makes sense really, doesn't it? So kind of irritating. So something that has very much impressed me with this camera is its buffer capacity. And I don't necessarily think it has a huge buffer, but what it does have is a very fast card interface. And if you have a fast CF Express Type B card in this, and I have one, because they are horribly expensive. I have a Delkin Black 150 gigabyte one, this one. This is a very fast card. I can't actually remember exactly how fast. I'll stick it on the screen. And with this card as my photo memory card, the buffer is effectively unlimited for 20 FPS raw photos at 45 megapixel, lossy compressed raw, not the uncompressed raw. I think it's somewhere up around 1,000. I'm not really sure. This card can only hold 4,000 photos, so you know you'd be crazy to shoot that amount anyway. But it's insane, and you can just guarantee it's not going to run out. This has been the biggest upgrade to me over any previous camera I've owned, because every previous camera I've owned, you did have to mentally track how many shots you had in your buffer if you're crazy like me and you take way too many photos. The OM1, for example, hits its buffer quite quickly. It does clear it quite quickly, but it's limited by it only using SD cards, and this camera does not have that limitation. You can just keep shooting. I never even think about the buffer on this camera. And you don't need the most expensive cards to get good buffer performance from this. I also have Angel Bird cards. These are the cheap Angel Bird cards. Where are you going? You're going to get the AV Pro SE. These are quite affordable for the sizes. I mostly use these for video, so they act as a second card in the camera, and I record video to these because the capacity is so much higher. But although the buffer performance isn't the same as with the very fast Delkin Black card, it's still better than most other cameras I've used. You will hit a slowdown relatively soon, you know, after about 100 photos or so, but it's still going around sort of 10 to 15 FPS after that, and seemingly continuously. I do think if you have this camera and you want to shoot a lot of action photography, you should just get the fastest card available. These Delkin Black cards have been really good, but it's nice to know that you can also use a cheaper card and still get most of that performance without having to go bankrupt, because the Delkin Black cards are quite expensive. Not as expensive as, say, the Sony CF Express Type A cards for their cameras, which are also slower. So, you know, it's not the end of the world, but the performance is there and it's very impressive. One thing it is missing, though, that I'm going to count as a buffer feature is it still cannot do pre-capture mode with raw photographs. This is something the OM1 could do, and I used quite a lot actually to get photos of birds taking flight, things like that. I really liked being able to do that, and I don't shoot JPEG mode on this for wildlife because I do tend to edit the photos. I like being able to denoise them, stuff like that. And therefore, I don't use the pre-capture mode on this. In fact, I've never used it because I know that because of the low light levels here in Wales, I need to denoise my photos usually. and therefore shooting JPEG only is not really an option for me. There is a bit of a rumor that they may be bringing RAW support to this feature in a future firmware update. If they do, I will be very happy and will immediately start taking far too many photos of birds taking off again. It would be just a huge improvement to this camera, and I don't really see a reason why it's not supported so far. Maybe there are some inefficiencies that they need to fix inside how that feature works, for example. But the OM1 already does this. In fact, there's a bunch of other cameras now that do RAW pre-capture, and I think the G9 too does. I've got a feeling some of the Sony cameras do. I think even Canon cameras do. So this is a feature that Nikon could improve upon, and I'll be very happy when they do so. So my last real point about this camera is around its autofocus. I said that very grandiosely. Overall, this camera performs very well, but it's changed over time. It's improved a lot, even since I've owned it, but it has improved dramatically since the first version. Nikon have been putting a lot of effort into improving their autofocus. And in general, it works fantastically. It's brilliant at birds in flight. Here's a bunch of photos I've taken this year. I haven't made videos about all of these. I did do a video on my settings and sort of approach to birds in flight, and in fact I've got one about the birds in flight AF settings I use for this camera, which I will stick up here because it's very relevant. It was, however, made like one day before they brought out the bird AF feature. However, I have tested the bird AF feature, and it's a little bit better in some situations, I think, than the animal AF, but it was good already. It worked very effectively, and for birds in flight, it doesn't make a massive amount of difference, if I'm honest, because usually object detection is not really fast enough anyway when birds are flying directly at you. The actual performance of the camera in terms of pulling focus and just focusing on the closest thing to it is fantastic. It works brilliantly. I've gotten some of my favorite bird photos using this camera. It's just really, really good. But there are some flaws with the autofocus in this. I do find, for example, that it still has a tendency, as basically every camera does, to drop focus to the background and then pop back again. It happens in certain scenarios, particularly if the birds are quite small. And the reason why is effectively because, say, the AF point is this big. I mean, it's not. But on the sensor, and the bird's head maybe fills 2/3 of it or something. If there's low contrast around the edge of it, it will drop to the background, and because it's still within the autofocus point, so it can often struggle to actually differentiate the two if it's low contrast and it's using contrast to confirm its focus. Maybe it's quite far away and the phase detection isn't really noticing a huge amount of difference either. There's certain scenarios where it does happen. That's not a huge issue because the chances are, if you're shooting at that sort of distance, the photo's not going to come out amazing anyway because it's very small in the frame. When the subject is big in the frame, works much better. I don't really have that issue. You do occasionally notice it sort of shifting slightly. It's almost like the Panasonic depth from defocus feature, where it would pulsate. It's nowhere near as bad as that, but you do notice it occasionally because all these cameras work as a combination of phase detect and contrast detect, and you do notice sometimes that little sort of thing where it's confirming focus with the contrast detection. However, there is a problem with the autofocus that they still haven't fixed, and that is what most people refer to as eyelash focusing. I don't notice this myself on eyelashes because I don't photograph people very much. And to be honest, people and their eyelashes aren't really a huge issue. But when you're using a telephoto lens, the section that's in focus is extremely thin. Like the actual depth of field is tiny. Even f6.3 on a 600mm lens, you're looking at like millimeters that are actually in focus. And this is where that size of AF point comes back into it again. it has a real tendency to do what I'm going to call cheek focusing on birds. So the AF point, thanks to the AF system, the object detection, will focus on the eye of the bird. Brilliant. But the box overlaps very slightly the feathers just below their eye, and that's what it focuses on because they're slightly closer than the eyeball itself. And unfortunately, this happens quite a lot. It's not a huge issue because you can just shoot a little bit deeper, like f8, and it will cover that issue. But it does happen, and they seemingly haven't fixed it so far. It is kind of one of those things where I would expect them to make an accommodation for it in the AF system. I believe Sony have done this, where they actually, when they're focusing on an eye, they are actually allowing the focus to shift slightly. They're understanding that the autofocus point is going to be picking up some aspect of the eye that is closer than the eyeball itself. But in those situations where it is trying to focus on an eye, I believe that they actually shift the focus very slightly further forwards to make sure that the eye is in focus. And this is something that I think is missing from the Nikon system. It happens a lot, and it's not the end of the world. It doesn't matter if birds are slightly smaller, for example, but if you're doing an extremely close, tightly framed portrait of a bird, chances are that if they're slightly angled, for example, not just flat on, it's going to focus sort of just on the feathers on the side of the beak, just in front of the eye. And it's quite annoying, but it's not the end of the world, and it isn't something that has inconvenienced me personally, because when I'm taking those sorts of photos, I do just put it to f8 instead. This is something they can fix still. I thought that they might introduce an improvement for that with the bird autofocus that they added in the most recent firmware version, but it still seems to be the case, in my opinion, and from my own testing. So yeah, that's kind of it for my impressions of the Nikon Z9 over the last 6 months. Very happy with this camera. I've got no plans to get rid of it. I foresee it being a very important part of my setup for a long time. It's just a reliable camera, as in I can rely on it. I've only had it for 6 months. Who knows what the actual mechanical reliability will be like long term, but it hasn't, broken its mount yet like the Fuji X-H2S did. So it's got that going for it. And overall, I just really, really like using it as a thing. It's just comfortable and it gets out of my way. When I'm doing wildlife photography, it isn't a factor, if that makes sense. I'm not focused on working around problems with the camera. It's just a tool that allows me to get on with what I'm trying to do. And for things like birds in flight photography, where you don't really have time to mess around with things, once you've got this set up for that purpose, it's just not in the way, then that's a huge compliment to it, in my opinion, because every other camera I have used has gotten in my way in some way, such as like small buffer sizes on the IM1 or the X-H2S disassembling itself. But overall, really, really like this camera, and I'm not going to say I recommend it just because it's hilariously expensive. And if you don't need the battery grip, if you don't need the few extra features that come with the Z9, maybe you don't need the durability of the Z9 over the Z8 because they are constructed slightly differently, then I would definitely say that the Z8 is a better purchase. But for me, this was a fantastic purchase and has been well worth it for me. Yes, if you have any comments about the Z9 yourself, or perhaps the Z8, ZF, any other camera, whatever floats your boat, please do put them down in the comments below. Equally, if you have any questions that I haven't covered in this, maybe something that you want to know about this camera, please do put that down there as well. I'm more than happy to answer any questions about it. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you next time.